Well, now I feel like I have to be smart, so this is going to be tricky. Yeah, so you're in for a treat. This is a pretty rare scenario. In the Apple products, they just work. Well, it ate my keynote 5 minutes before we started. Fortunately, my iPad has a copy of it, and we have an overhead projector. That's right. That's how we're going to roll today. So, the title of this session is "The Page is Dead, Long Live the Page." Anybody who's been listening to some of the heated discussions going on in the Drupal community around content strategy and like design-related stuff has probably overheard some interesting and fascinating conversations around things like WYSIWYG editing, how we, what kind of metaphors we should present to people for editing and designing, pages on their website and stuff like that. The idea that I want to get to with this session is that the idea of the page as a central metaphor for what we do is slowly fading out as something that really helps us and has become something that holds us back. That's what we're going to be talking about. I shouldn't really bother with my introduction since I got a glowing introduction. But yes, I'm Jeff Eaton. If you want to say mean things or heckle me, I'm Eaton on Twitter. So feel free to shout things or just disagree vigorously. So the key idea that I want to get to here is that pages aren't content. What we refer to as pages in a modern website, especially with Drupal, there is not a one-to-one relationship with a piece of content and a page anymore. Pages are where our content lives, so they're important as an organizational tool and as the primary place that users come and can interface with our websites. There's a URL and a page lives there, of course. But the page is where we put all of the stuff we're making and we're maintaining, not the thing itself. There may be opinions and not necessarily factual things that are discussed here. Again, feel free to object or perhaps throw a thing. Please don't damage the equipment. I always like to start this conversation with a story about when Blake Hall and I had just finished up a project. We were on site at a client's. We had just the site had been launched. We were finishing up some training with them. And it had been a really long couple of weeks. So we went back to the hotel we were staying at. We went down to the bar and we're like, okay, let's get a drink. The bartender's like, so, what do you guys do? It's like, we make websites. He's like, oh, really? Oh, yeah, my brother does that. He does a lot of web stuff. That's good work. And I was like, yeah. He's like, so what kind of sites do you do? Blake's like, well, we just did the Grammys. Okay. Bartender's just like, whoa. And I always love this. He's like, that's a lot of pages. and I was like, how do you really, it's like, well, not quite. Yeah, it was a lot of pages. And I've thought about that a lot since then. And it's interesting because despite all of the tools that we use and all of the really cool stuff that we've built in order to dynamically, render 80 bajillion different things depending on who's logged in and throw up different stuff on the page depending on what time of day it is or whatever, the page is still this fundamental metaphor that we use when we think about the structure of the site, and it's still really easy to find either clients or stakeholders or sometimes developers or whatever who think about the work they're going to do in pages. Like, how many of them are there? How big is this site? Well, how many pages are there? Let's do an inventory and figure out how many pages there are. This keeps coming up over and over. And I started thinking about how it's not a really good match. So I wanted to go back and find where this whole page thing got started. Who started this? And as it turns out, I can't really complain too much because the first reference to a page on the web was actually in Tim Berners-Lee's 1990 proposal to make the web. as a side project for his company. He's like, oh, well, they're connected to each other as nodes, so suck it, WordPress. We're not changing the name. He also said that, you know, phase 1 of the web should be finished in about 3 months. And I think phase 2 consisted of taking pictures of all the cats and is still in progress. But I thought it was very interesting that this idea of the page as a useful metaphor to help people get over the hump of this new weird thing that was being built happened very, very early. And it was definitely useful. This is a little odd with the, oh, excellent, right there. See, that's analog technology for you. And this is a program called HyperCard. Does anybody remember HyperCard? Yeah. I like to anger Larry Garfield by referring to it as a wonderful piece of open source software from the 80s. It wasn't. But one of the things that HyperCard did way back in the 80s, before the web even existed, was it gave people a way to build hypertext documents and custom apps and stuff like that out of what it referred to as cards. You could make individual cards that were in a stack. The actual files were called stacks. And you could write code, and they could, you know, originally it was like, oh, you could paint on them, and you could put text on them, and then you could have buttons to flip between them. Let's call them links, say. But it was a really powerful and interesting piece of software. But what a lot of people found was this metaphor of cards in a stack ended up becoming a real drag on people's understanding once they got past a certain point. Because really there were just a bunch of different screens that you could write code on and have them do stuff. And the fact that they were called cards was just a useful introductory metaphor, not really the essence of what was going on in this piece of software. It was just a series of linked documents that could do stuff and have code. And that's another case of the useful metaphor that helps us get over the hump of initial understanding turning into a detriment. This is also another one of my favorite issues in Drupal. A couple of years back, we discovered that naming one of our content types page actually kind of confused the heck out of people when they wanted to edit the sidebars on a given page. Or it's like, look, I want to change the title on this page. So what do? I'll make a page. It's like, oh no, a page is only the stuff inside the middle of the page. Oh, crap. So we decided that the solution was to change the name of it to Basic Page, which probably didn't really fundamentally change the misunderstanding that was going on. But like even in that issue, there's this knowledge that there's a weird tension in our terminology. The pieces of content we make aren't the page. They're just something that lives there. And this actually becomes a lot more difficult. Like even referring to things as a page, this basic unit of content that we've got. I'm going to use the word page so many times, you will never want to hear it again. But when we're just talking about websites even, it can still serve as a useful metaphor. The challenge is when we start adding new elements to that. Like, oh, well now my boss says that I need some sort of like weird iOS app that displays our news. And now I need to pull stuff in from our feed of content. Well, if you're thinking about them as like sort of these weird platonic content blobs that live out there in some way, oh, that makes a lot of sense. But if you're thinking about things as pages, that metaphor immediately starts to break down. You're not feeding pages into this iPhone app. You're pulling in content and presenting them in a different way. And it gets even worse because really, the picture looks more like this for most of us. It's not just an app and a website or whatever. It's a whole cloud of all the different places where our content has to live and the stuff that it has to do in order to achieve the goals that we've got. And in no way does the page really work as a unifying metaphor for all of these things. It can't be the way that we really understand what we're making. Does anybody know the story of the Ballad of John Henry? It's got turned into a Disney cartoon, which is where I got a screenshot of this from. I totally did not torrent that. That was awkward. It's basically a story of a guy named John Henry. He's, works on the rail lines. He pounds steaks, and he's one of the strong dudes who helps build the rail. And then the rail company makes this giant steam engine that can go in and pound rail spikes and lay tracks faster than the team that John Henry is a part of. And it's this big epic conflict where he ends up going out and has a race to save his team of workers. And he takes one hammer in each hand, and he goes out and he pounds railroad spikes faster than this giant machine that's laying down, track. And then he dies of a heart attack at the end. It's actually a terrible story. But I was thinking, this is a perfect metaphor for how we think of CMSs. Less heart attacks in most cases, depending on whether it's launch day. But the idea that despite all of the advances we've got, we still tend to treat the CMS as a giant machine that's good at building pages faster than a person could build them. It's a tool, it's like a force multiplier for the webmaster, who used to be like this HTML ninja who could run regular expressions to update the footer when it changed from 2008 to 2009, and you had to change all the footers. The CMS automates that. It's the giant steam engine of making pages. But again, then we come back to this problem. It's not really pages that we're making anymore. Karen McGrain, who's one of my favorite writers on this stuff, said in the Harvard Business Review that the way that we publish stuff on the web is really derived primarily from what we learned over hundreds of years of print publishing. And that's where this idea of the page is a very comforting and familiar way to understand, I've got stuff and I need to put it somewhere. Let's call it a page, because that's where stuff goes. But the problem is that the future of content, as she says, is in small, discrete little chunks of stuff that can be reassembled and reconfigured on the fly. And we're actually very familiar with this in the Drupal world. Like the idea that a piece of content is made up of a bunch of different fields, and you can have different display modes, and we show them in different contexts and different sizes. And some display modes may only show a little bit of it, others may show all of it. Different devices may use them in different ways. That idea of a piece of content being this sort of bundle of useful stuff that we can remix, that's there on a technical basis. But it's still really easy for us to slip into the page as the way we imagine stuff. We start with, say, a mock-up that a designer created. And we find all the places that we know are going to have to change from article to article or from post to post or whatever. And that's what our fields are. They're like little cut out portions of a static page design that we say, well, those will change, so those are our fields, and that's our content type now. But that's where we run into these problems. That kind of thinking doesn't serve us well when it has to explode out into all of those different forms. The really important idea, the way to get over this, is to start decoupling the idea of a piece of content that we're creating from the pages where it lives on a Drupal site. Now, some of the people in the room are probably like, this is, it's like, okay, I know this, yeah, decoupling. Woohoo! Don't let the presentation, affect the underlying content, a lot of people get that. But there's a quote that I really, really loved. User Advocate on Twitter. He's one of the people that's active in the Drupal UX community. One of the things that he said at Drupal Camp Toronto a couple of years ago that I really loved was that what we used to call the page has become a unit of business intent. Now, that really does sound like something an MBA would say, but what he meant by that was that a page is no longer, again, a piece of content that lives somewhere on the site, but rather something that is important to the people who are paying for the site or the people who are visiting the site. It's an idea that lives somewhere on the site, and the content is just the stuff that we're using to fill that need. They may need to, say, learn about how to apply for insurance benefits, or the business may want to tell all of their customers about a new product or something like that. That page isn't necessarily a node. It's the place where we communicate about a product. That's what defines it, and the content is something that serves that underlying need. one of the things that I try to, this can be a really tricky concept to shift to, depending on how familiar you are with like that. We build a page, there's folders full of them, that's what we do. You know, that way of looking at it, it can be tough. One of the things that I find helps is to start looking at like that classic sitemap of your website, you know, the tree with all of the little page icons underneath it, because, you know, we still use page icons to represent the final little bits on the tree. Imagining that as a map of different kinds of goals, different communication goals, as opposed to different discrete units of content. Some of them may be single pieces of content that live at those little leaf nodes, but other ones might be assembled out of multiple pieces of content. Some of them might be dynamic, like with a view that, you know, pulls in all of the staff and shows them in a particular form. You might use something like panels to assemble a really complex multi-element page out of a bunch of individual pieces of content. But what you're doing is you're building out a site out of those things that you want to communicate, and the content serves that. And that's the kicker. Content isn't pages. It's how we achieve those different goals that exist on our website. So the sitemap is really just a tree of all the things that we want to communicate, and the content serves that in a bunch of different ways, sometimes by being a post per URL, other times by being assembled dynamically. At Lullaby, we do a lot of this. The sites that we end up building have, I'll say, a fair degree of complexity. They got a lot of pages. We tend to try to break down the content that we work with on these sites into a couple of different categories. One of them we call assets. Yeah, okay, you can see that. It's asset content is the stuff that has like primary business value. It's like if you're an e-commerce company, your product nodes or your product entities on your Drupal site, those are a primary asset. They are what you do. They're what people come to the website to see. If you don't have those, you might as well just close up shop, because that's what people care about and they come for. Those are the things that tend to be reused a lot. And you want to make sure that the structure that you model and the fields that you set up for them are really well matched to what a product really is for your company. Because, you know, you might want to pipe those to an iOS app, or you might want to put those in an RSS feed that's really nicely formatted or whatever. That's the kind of stuff that is going to have to eventually blast out there and live in a lot of different places in a lot of different ways. There's also structural content. And this is a little bit of a controversy because taxonomy terms and taxonomy vocabularies in Drupal probably fall under this banner. It's the kind of stuff that we use to organize all of those assets. I swore I was not going to get sucked into a discussion about taxonomy terms versus node references. Node references. But the idea is that those structural elements you use to organize your site are meaningful content just as much as a news post or an article node. They're just a different kind of content. The other one that we end up relying on a lot is what we call presentational content. It's not necessarily like, you know, media assets or anything like that. It could be stuff that lives in the rotator on the home page. These aren't fundamentally important key things that keep people come to the site to visit. It's like, I want that slide, you know, slide number 3 on the homepage rotator. That's why I came to your website this morning. Although there are stakeholders who really deep in their hearts believe that's what the use case is. But those presentational content types are basically the stuff that serves a given design, or the website needs some of those different pieces to really be filled out properly. You know, the stuff in the sidebar, you know, it needs to be updated. So that's real content, but it's not that primary business asset. Dividing things into these kinds of groups helps us start thinking about the pages that we're designing as assemblies of different things that have different criteria and serve different goals, rather than just, you know, that one-to-one correlation between a piece of content and a page. It also helps because we can invest a lot of energy in making sure that asset-oriented content is reusable and is, that the structure we've planned for them is going to be good for the next 3 years or whatever. But we know that presentational content isn't going to be as reused as rigorously. So we can sort of just bolt together whatever is needed for this week's design and stuff like that. It works well. The key idea, though, is that when we start designing the content that we have on the site, we're not attempting to model how it's going to look on a given page. What we're modeling is what that piece of content really means. What makes a product a product? What makes a news article a news article? What makes a job opening a job opening? What are the key pieces of information that are unique and inherent to that? That kind of thinking is a lot easier to preserve and continue reusing and moving forward than thinking, how does the job page look? Thus, let's build a content type to make that page. That switch it's a subtle one, but it ends up having a lot of far-reaching implications. I like to sum it up as with a Bruce Lee quote. We've got like Disney movies, we've got dudes racing giant machines, we've got Bruce Lee quotes. I'm happy with where we're going. He says, don't get set in one form. You put water in a cup, it becomes the cup. You put water in a bottle, it becomes the bottle. You put it in a teapot, it becomes the teapot. He says, be like water. Now, he was talking about jujitsu. I'm talking about content types, so there's a little bit of difference. But I like to think, yeah, that's what we do. Hardcore. So that kind of decoupling, the idea of building our content for its inherent meaning rather than how it's going to look in the current design, it is very closely related to this disconnect between the page and the underlying content. The way that I tend to like to explain some of this stuff is to dig into a couple of useful examples of some real actual websites, what they were trying to accomplish and the problems they were running into, and how this approach helped them. The first one I like to point out is just a traditional marketing site. This was a client that we were working with. They do web hosting, and they've got products that they sell. They've got services that people can sign up for and stuff like that. But one of the problems that they were facing was they had like a dozen sites in different countries and a bunch of different products and services, and they were all being maintained separately. It's like a classic Drupal use case. But what they wanted to do is they wanted to be very consistent in how they talked about their products and services. When somebody describes their security, they wanted the language and the message around that to be something that was consistent wherever they talked about security or great service or things like that. They wanted their marketing department to stop reinventing the wheel and stop coming up with new ways to talk about our great customer service every time they needed to talk about that. So they wanted a library of like assets they could reuse all of the time to discuss and promote those things. This is the content model that they ended up building out. The bold orange boxes are things that correlate to what we would call a page in classic HTML. But all of these boxes are actually nodes in Drupal. They organized things with under solutions and products. Like in that model that I was talking about, those would probably be structural content types. They're used to organize and group things intelligently. Then they had just page nodes. That's it. They just called them pages because that's what they were. We want to put a page on the website that covers this particular service or this particular thing that we want to brag about. But each one of those pages didn't have any actual body copy or images associated with it or whatever. It was a container for these fragment nodes that they built. And the fragment nodes were those individual messages that their marketing department was building about what the canonical description for a particular product or service was, what their policy on support is, all of these different messages that they had. A page was really just an assembly of those different things so that the marketing department could throw together a page with a given message pretty quickly. Sometimes they would write additional fragments that would only really get used on one of those pages. But the idea was that they could reuse those things and they could leverage each other's work in constantly improving the quality of what they were communicating and stuff like that. That's an actual, what? I believe it's also the next slide. So we will return to that. I'll also be posting a PDF of the slides. Oh, well. Actually, I think we will have a little bit of extra time at the end for questions, so we can jump back to that. But the idea is like that, you know, file and data backup and highly secure and reliable solutions and e-commerce hosting. All of those different little elements on the page are actual individual nodes that their marketing department could just make a new page, start assembling those different elements, and then I mean, from an end user's perspective, the only difference they see is that there's more consistency in the messaging here, not that it's been bolted together out of a bunch of stuff. But for the marketing department, it was actually a big win. And naturally, also, it had to be localized into like 20 different languages, which makes it a fun adventure no matter what. But you know, it's a fairly simple example. Another one that is a really fun and kind of goofy one is a corporate intranet that we worked on a while ago. It was basically the HR department of a pretty large technology firm wanted to completely revamp the site where all of their policies and their insurance information and like their how do you get reimbursed for travel and you know when can you apply for a new insurance plan and stuff like that. All of those things lived on about 50,000 pages on split up based on region and based on language and stuff like that. Their goal, and it was a fun goal to have tossed down in the initial meeting, was they wanted to reduce that to 50 pages. They wanted all of the information on those 50,000 pages to be there, but they just wanted 50 pages. And it needed to just tailor itself to whoever happened to be reading it, so they would only see the stuff that they needed. That was an interesting opening volley in the requirements discussion. But it actually ended up working, and it was built with Drupal. The only things in their entire content model that really correlated to a page were this idea of a topic and a subtopic. They decided they wanted to boil it down to like the 50 things that their employees were going to care about when they came to this page. And they did a lot of research going in to figure out what those 50 core topics and subtopics were. But underneath each one of those topics and subtopics was a giant pool of actual nodes that contained the real body text and the images and stuff like that. There were also audience descriptors that they kept track of. And each one of those nodes that contained the real content got tagged with all kinds of audience information. Like, this is the travel reimbursement document for people in China who are full-time employees in this particular part of the company. And when someone visited a subtopic page, it would dynamically load in whatever document matched their needs. And they even used some special markup. So inside of the body, they could like flag a paragraph as, this is only for part-time people. Hide it if part-time people don't, if a part-time person is viewing this. And an input filter would hide some of that stuff. But the real kicker for it was this idea of topics and subtopics as the pages that people visited, and these document nodes that no one would ever directly visit. There weren't even publicly accessible URLs for those subnodes that contained the real meat. Everyone just looked at a page and they got information that was tailored to them. I didn't actually think it was possible when we started, but they did reduce it to, it was about 60 pages at the end. But they did a pretty good job. And it actually ended up looking really well. It was like, it worked. It was a super clean website. And considering the fact that they literally had, about 50,000 individual pages before, it really, really helped them. And I was thoroughly impressed by how it turned out. That sounds like a sort of pat yourself on the back thing, but it was interesting how much that approach, leaving behind the idea that there was a one-to-one correlation between the stuff that they were writing and a page on the website, really helped a lot. Another one recently was a video streaming service. They basically, I keep talking through what the next slide is going to be. They basically wanted to provide a service where people who wanted to view sports videos could just come to their site and see like a fresh promoted selection of what was hot this week in sports and stuff like that. But they also didn't host any of the videos themselves. They were actually they were going to be an intermediary between cable providers around the country, and that was special, you know. Somebody accessed you from the internet. What cable provider should they authenticate through? You know, where should we actually pull the video from? Does someone in Nebraska actually have the rights to view this video? All kinds of crazy stuff. They ended up using Drupal, and it was the weirdest content model I've ever seen, because that middle chunk right there is what the nodes in Drupal were. They never actually had pages on the website that corresponded to Drupal nodes at all. They used nodes as a way of the editors of the site and the people who were managing it capturing what was currently being promoted, what kind of metadata a given video or a given sporting event needed. And they would make those nodes, and those nodes would end up getting piped to a JavaScript-driven application on the front end that would just show them like a wall of videos and stuff like that. And the actual meaty content was coming from those from the cable providers. But Drupal was sitting there in the middle, and the pieces of content they were building were driving a complex web application, but they never correlated to pages or anything like that. That was actually the Pac-12 website. I'm told by sports ball familiar friends that the Pac-12 is important. I'm not dissing it, I'm just saying I learned that it was a thing about the time that they were telling me that this was exciting. So I am told that the oblong sports balls that get thrown and the ones that you bounce all appear on this website. But yeah, it was actually really interesting because it was basically a JavaScript application powered by Drupal. Which is not a common use case, but we're actually seeing more and more people start working with that kind of model. And the final one, and I gotta say, this is my favorite, is a cookbook. Has anybody ever made a recipe website with Drupal? God bless you all. Has anybody installed recipe module? So sorry. It's, so basically, it started out with a Seattle area chef that he had a really cool and idiosyncratic philosophy of food. Like, he believed that there were only 3 seasons, which actually kind of makes sense knowing he was in Seattle. But, you know, and like he believed that, you know, these 3 core seasons defined the essence of what food was. And he had a lot of really interesting, cool stuff to say, and he was a great chef. And he wanted to do a cookbook, but a friend of his actually decided, you know, I bet we could do more than just a cookbook. I bet we could do a lot of interesting stuff with this. And they actually ended up building a Drupal site to store all of the recipes. But it wasn't quite the way you might expect. This was what their content model ended up looking like. It was pretty complex. They track things like seasons, the varietals, like, you know, this is meat-oriented. This is, I can't remember what the word for it is. There is an actual word for cheeses and things that get cured and sausage. There's a single word for that. Delicious. Yes, that's the right word. Check. But they had a recipe, but each recipe actually got aggregated into plates. So you could have the same side that gets used in a bunch of different full place settings. Individual steps in the recipe were modeled. Inside of each step, the ingredients used in that step and the cooking techniques used in that particular step were modeled. And then they had all kinds of media assets. They originally started thinking they were going to do the traditional, and we'll take a picture of each dish. And it turns out, like, it was just all of these gorgeous images of like him doing prep work. And they're like, well, let's just take a photo of every step. And they had a guy who was going to film a video introduction. And it turns out that like the chef just wanted to like walk around Seattle talking about food philosophy. And it's like, okay, let's just keep filming. Let's keep rolling. So they ended up with tons of media assets, and he's like, oh, well, I could just demonstrate how to fold eggs or something like that. It's like, okay, let's record it. So they had this huge library of stuff with a relatively complex and nuanced model of like what constitutes making a dish or something like that. And they built a Drupal site whose only job was to map and model that stuff and to provide an interface for the people who were just fire hosing this stuff. And they were actually funded by a Kickstarter project for the people who wanted this cookbook. What they ended up producing was a website. If you actually go to larkcookbook.com, you can see this. The website that's publicly visible is only a subset of the recipes. It's one of the output formats for the Drupal site that they built. This isn't the site that they built. It's where they're piping a subset of the data to promote the cookbook. They also have an iPad app. It's a really gorgeous, lush iPad app with all of the videos for like, how you fold eggs and, what all the different, parts of the, dishes are and stuff like that. It's driven from the same Drupal site. They also have a really gorgeous actual like print cookbook that is being generated from this Drupal website with all of the high-res media assets. Clearly, they can include the videos and training materials and stuff like that. But they have these different pools of content that are being used in different ways in these different kinds of output media. And there's definitely design work that goes into the book that's different than what goes into the iPad app. But the idea is that the really, really tricky work of modeling what they're dealing with. What is the essence of this cookbook, the heart of what people care about and why they're coming to the Lark cookbook, regardless of what form they're looking at it in. That's what they modeled, and that's what they swept bullets over. And clearly a lot of work went into the presentational stuff too, but that approach allowed them to roll out like 5 different versions of this cookbook, one for the Kindle, one for iBooks, one for an actual app, one for print, one for web, without having to go back and reinvent the wheel and like tear up their foundation and repurpose it. That's an incredibly powerful example. And I think it's really interesting because it also flies in the face of the usual things that we tend to see, like, oh, well, how do you do decoupled content models? Well, like NPR, they fire hose stories to their 89 bajillion partners using an API. It's like, well, yeah, but that's just stories. It's like this. This is a really crazy example of a decoupled content model. They're making books and websites and iPad apps and stuff like that. It's pretty fun. And that comes back to this idea of what kind of content that you have. We're used to asking, what kind of page is it? We look at the wireframes, we look at the mock-ups, and we go, oh, well, this is a news page, or this is a product review page, or this is a user profile page. And when we step back from those kinds of assumptions, and we start asking ourselves, what's the essence of this thing that we're actually capturing, that people care about? Why would they care about it? Why would they come and view this? When we start asking ourselves those questions, and then once we've modeled that stuff, we start thinking about our website as being a collection of pages, a collection of places people can visit that we assemble and populate using all of that stuff, it's not actually different than what we have the tools for in Drupal. We've got all of the stuff we need to work that way, but it's not how we're used to thinking about it. There's a lot of power in it. So the lessons I think we can walk away from this, A, remembering that pages are just a metaphor. The next time a designer just waves a stack of PDF files at you and insists that it's got to look that way, or isn't thinking beyond the pure visual designs that they're creating, this might be a useful discussion to have. Remembering that these pages aren't the thing we're making, they're just how we happen to accomplish these communications goals on the web. Also, purely pursuing the end of giving people better tools to make pages visually is useful, but it doesn't solve this underlying challenge that we face of our content having to live in a bunch of different places. Prioritizing the underlying meaning of these content assets we have and figuring out what the actual goals are. what we're trying to accomplish with the content that we put online, what the value for the business that's paying for it is, and what the value is for the people who are visiting. Those kinds of things help prioritize these decisions way more effectively than purely visual design-oriented questions. The presentation layer, like whether we think about it as the theme or all the views and the panels or an iPhone app that pulls stuff in or a physical cookbook or whatever, it uses and remixes and repurposes all of those content assets in interesting ways. Sometimes it differs wildly from one medium to another. Other times it's consistent. And we're just doing things like responsive design, where the layout may change, but the stuff itself is the same. The idea is that the presentation layer that we're building uses and is populated by and repurposes all that content in interesting ways. And finally, this content-first way of approaching stuff, it's future-friendly. It sets you up for unexpected new things you have to do in the future a lot more than a visually oriented process. If you're thinking about the design that you're currently working against as the guiding idea behind what you're building, it's very easy to be screwed when the design changes a year later. You suddenly realize, oh, all our content types have to get reworked because the design is different. But if you've been thinking about the design as something that uses and repurposes that stuff that exists in its own place, in its own form, you're usually in a much better place when those design things end up changing. That's all. I am now at the end. I was planning on putting a gratuitous cat picture of my cat Maddie in at the end, but we weren't anticipating the overhead of having to actually set up an honest-to-goodness projector. But I think that definitely, the novelty of it definitely, I'll just adjust the slides. The novelty of that definitely made up for it, but that's it. The page, it's always going to be with us as long as we have things that are printed or things that are viewed at a URL in a browser. But it's dead as a useful organizing metaphor for the kind of work that we do with a tool like Drupal. And remembering that distinction is important. That's all. Thank you. Do we have any time for some of those questions? Or? No. There was a question earlier about the content model. I think we've got a little bit of time. Oh.
I was wondering, whoa. I have a very loud voice. I was looking, I'm trying to understand this asset structures presentation. I get the presentation, that's easy. I was looking at your models in each of your examples, and what I was hoping you would do is talk about the difference between assets and structure as you were talking about those models. So in the first one you had solutions, products, page, fragments. I can make a guess at what the assets and the structure is, but I'd really like to hear you kind of pull that apart for me a little bit more,
yeah,
so I can understand the real stuff behind what you're saying.
So in this case, like the Rackspace example, I would probably say that solution and product were structural content types. Like no one was coming to the page to say, I want to look at the product overview page. What is your list of solutions? You know, they may use that to get to something they care about, and it's useful for, you know, organizing things so that people can find what they want. But what people are really looking for was those underlying like pages that sort of consolidated everything into a message that they wanted to learn about setting up a cloud VPS hosting account or something like that. And that's where the page, I would probably say, these are, I mean, there isn't a hard and fast rule. You know, this is what, like Jared Ponchot, our design director at Lullabot, we have lots of long, you know, late into the night at client on-site, you know, conversations, you know, ironing some of these things out. But like in this example, I would say those individual fragments would definitely be assets. You know, those are important messages that we know we're going to be reusing. They need to be with us for a long time. And those are like when we make one of those, we've created value that we don't want to lose. So we want to make sure that those can stay with us and be repurposed. I would say the page in this model lived in sort of the middle ground between a structural content type and an asset content type. I'd probably say it was an asset because putting together the page about a particular product that really describes and captures it effectively, that's valuable meaning and intent in that page node, even though a lot of the actual textual copy and the images that go with it were contained in those fragments. So like the assets in this model were a combination of the pages and the fragments, and the solutions and products were structural content types. And although I don't have it in the model, they also had lots of things like, and the stuff for the front page rotator, and the little promotional blurb we always have to put up on the front page whenever June rolls around. And those kinds of things were pure promotional types. And we tend to be a lot more comfortable not spending a lot of time, ironing out exactly what content types are and what's the workflow for those promotional types. It's like, it's a block, it's gonna go there, sure, raw HTML, whatever, knock yourselves out, because it's gonna go away in 2 weeks. That it's more like the ephemeral stuff that it allows us to sort of sandbox that rapidly changing stuff that isn't gonna need to stick around for a long time. But I think let's see, in the example of the intranet, like topic and subtopic were structural organizational elements, and the real underlying assets were all of those documents that they had created that held the real copy that was tailored to different audiences. In their case, they had a news content type that its sole purpose was to like populate the little, hey, what's happening on, in the office this week kind of stuff on the front page, and we treated that as a presentational content type. I'm not sure, I'm not sure if that helps clarify the distinction, but like if you were to think about it in a particular way, like I tend to say like the assets are content that people would actually want to read. Like they would say if it's in an RSS feed or something like that, that's what I'm subscribing to, those assets. But the structural content types, even though they might have like images attached to them in body copy because they've got a page on the website or whatever, a structural content type might correspond to what RSS feeds do you offer. Like it might be the place where you go to actually get the feed of the assets that are connected to it. And the presentational types are ones that would never appear in a feed. They're there to serve the design or whatever. Cool. Is there anything else? Just come out with a big hook when I need to shut up. Any other questions? Oh. This is like Donahue.
So I have a technical question that probably doesn't matter at all. But
panels.
But you made a number of references to nodes without visible URLs, and I was just thinking like, well, why nodes and why not an entity type that isn't a node?
Because I lied. The topics and subtopics in this diagram actually were entities. They were a custom hand-rolled entity rather than nodes. But that tends to be a site and project specific decision. We made those entities because actually Blake Hall, who's here, was the one who actually did all of the coding. I just waved my arms vigorously at important parts during the project. Blake actually wrote all of it. So if I lied at any point, he's going to be going over in the, really? Several times? Excellent. Okay, then I'm doing my job. But yeah, in that case, entities were used specifically because it gave a lot more control over what happens when that URL gets hit that they live at and stuff like that. But in theory, we could have used Page Manager to hijack that content types page and wrote different handlers to swap out what happens on that page. There's modules like I think Rabbit Hole is one of the existing contrib modules that lets you say certain content types there shouldn't be a publicly accessible URL for them, and somebody should just get dumped back to the home page. They shouldn't show up in the search index, stuff like that. It just meant doing them as custom entities just meant we were actively adding functionality rather than trying to strip away node-style functionality. Which way to go it's sort of a coin toss depending on like what your timeline is and how much node-ishness you're stripping away versus how much feature you're adding to a base entity.
Thank you.
One more question? It can't be Blake telling me I'm wrong. Was it entities? So yeah, in this conversation, we can probably safely swap entity for node, depending on what makes sense. I teethed on Drupal 5, so nodes are still, Nope.
Last question. In your example of fairly nested data model, did you ever find yourself wondering why you were using Drupal for that site?
Always.
Okay.
No.
Yeah, I'm saying that.
No. Not often, actually. Well, okay, the Pac-12 site, that's a question that came up a number of times. It was like, it's entities and a cable provider and JavaScript app. Why are we using Drupal? Meh, it works. But like in particular with the HR intranet example, Drupal still provided a lot of really useful functionality, and the ability to wire up really useful editorial tools without writing a bunch of code, things like the user system and the theming layer and stuff like that still really provide a lot of bang for your buck. And we were still using tools like views to build out different kinds of collections of related topics and subtopics. I think that's always sort of a consideration. Should we build this with Drupal or should we not? But anytime you got lots and lots of content that needs to be dealt with in lots of different ways, and maybe you have multiple people working with that content, Drupal brings a lot of good stuff to the table. Like we just had a client, just talked to a client who came up to us. It's like, okay, so this next month we're gonna have to figure out we need to do revisioning. It's like, I have good news for you. You may not have noticed, but there's a checkbox. They were like, really? That's awesome. They'd never noticed that they just had revisioning built in, and that conversation shaved 2 weeks off of their project for them, and they were thrilled. But there's a lot of those kinds of easy wins when you're really focusing on lots of content that gets built by people. That Drupal brings a ton of stuff to the table. So it's very easy to get distracted by all the Node.js hotness and various things that are going on. But if you really need that kind of content functionality, rebuilding it all from scratch is an arduous process. And I tease Drupal because I love Drupal. It really does do a lot of cool stuff. That's it. Thank you. Now go, and there's a lot of cool sessions coming up that talk about this stuff. Group photo. Yeah.